Most people don't fail to learn because they're stupid. They fail because they lie to themselves. They confuse exposure with understanding. They think watching, reading, or listening means learning. It doesn't. Learning begins the moment your brain says, I don't get this. That feeling, confusion, is not a warning sign. It's the doorway. If you run from confusion, you stay average. If you sit inside it and attack it, you grow fast. Here's the brutal rule. If you can't explain an idea in plain language, you don't understand it. Not because you're bad, but because your knowledge is fragile. Real learning forces you to strip ideas down until nothing unnecessary survives. No fancy words, no borrowed phrases, just cause, effect, and logic. This is why most people learn slowly. They never test their understanding. They consume information the way people collect souvenirs. To feel smart, not to become smart. Learning accelerates when you actively struggle. You explain ideas out loud. You write them from memory. You teach an imaginary beginner. You expose the gaps instead of hiding them. Mistakes are not shameful. They are feedback. If you're afraid of being wrong, you will protect your ego, not your intelligence, and ego is the enemy of speed. The fastest learners are not the smartest, they're the most curious. Curiosity creates pressure. Pressure forces questions. Questions demand answers. Discipline helps you start. Curiosity makes you unstoppable. So if you want to learn any skill fast, painfully fast, stop asking, how long will this take? Start asking, what don't I understand yet? Attack that question relentlessly. That's how learning stops feeling like school and starts feeling like you've hacked the system, not illegal, just honest. Confusion is not failure. It's the entry fee. Most people hear that sentence and nod, but they don't live by it. They still panic the moment they feel lost. The instant something doesn't make sense, they assume something is wrong with them. They back away, switch topics, blame the teacher, or tell themselves they're not made for this. That reaction is the real failure. Confusion isn't a signal to quit. It's proof you've reached the edge of what you currently understand, and growth only happens at edges. Think about it logically. If everything feels clear, familiar, and comfortable, then you're not learning. You're rehearsing what you already know. Real learning begins when your mental model breaks, when the pieces don't fit anymore. That uncomfortable tension in your head isn't a weakness. It's your brain trying to reorganize itself. Confusion is the cost of admission for understanding anything that actually matters. The problem is that most people treat confusion like an emergency. They rush to eliminate it instead of investigating it. They look for shortcuts, summaries, and simplified answers, not to understand better, but to feel better. They want relief, not insight. But relief is cheap, and insight is expensive. Insight demands that you stay confused longer than feels reasonable. Confusion forces you to ask precise questions, and precise questions are dangerous in the best way. They expose the exact point where your understanding collapses. Instead of saying, I don't get this, you start asking, which part doesn't make sense? Is it the assumption, the definition, the connection between two ideas? That level of clarity only comes after you stop running from confusion and start interrogating it. This is where learning speeds up dramatically. When you welcome confusion, you stop pretending. You stop hiding behind memorized phrases and borrowed explanations. You strip the idea down to its bones. You test it. You push it. You see where it fails. And every failure sharpens your understanding. Most people never do this because confusion bruises the ego. It exposes how little you actually know. It forces humility. And humility is uncomfortable in a world that rewards confidence over correctness. So people choose to sound smart instead of becoming smart. They repeat what they've heard. They copy explanations they don't fully understand. They mistake familiarity for mastery. But confusion doesn't care about your image. It doesn't negotiate. It sits there and waits. You can ignore it, but it doesn't go away. It just turns into shallow knowledge, the kind that collapses the moment you need to use it. The fastest learners accept a brutal truth. Feeling stupid is part of the process. Not occasionally, constantly. Every time you move into new territory, you will feel lost again. That's not a sign that you're bad at learning. It's a sign that you're doing it right. Confusion is also a filter. It separates those who are serious from those who just want the appearance of intelligence. Anyone can feel smart when things are easy. Very few people are willing to sit with not knowing, to struggle without immediate reward. But that struggle is where deep understanding is forged. When you stay with confusion, something interesting happens. Patterns start to emerge. The fog doesn't lift all at once, it thins. Small connections appear, one idea clicks, then another. Suddenly what felt impossible becomes obvious, and you can't believe you didn't see it earlier. That's the moment people call talent. But it isn't talent, it's persistence in confusion. And here's the part most people miss. Confusion is temporary, but clarity compounds. Once you truly understand something, it becomes a tool. You can reuse it, combine it, build on it. Each hard-earned insight makes the next one easier. But only if it's real understanding, not memorized noise. If you avoid confusion, you pay for it later with fragility. Your knowledge works only in perfect conditions. Change the problem slightly, and everything breaks. If you embrace confusion early, you build flexibility. You understand principles, not just procedures. You can adapt. You can reason. You can create. So stop treating confusion like a personal flaw. It's not an insult to your intelligence. It's an invitation. The question is whether you accept it. Most people don't. They turn back at the first sign of discomfort and wonder why they never get good at anything meaningful. If you want to learn faster than everyone else, you don't need better resources or secret techniques. You need a different relationship with confusion. You need to stop asking how to avoid it and start asking how to use it. Because the truth is simple and unforgiving. There is no shortcut around confusion. There is only one path, straight through it. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it. That sentence is uncomfortable because it removes every place to hide. It doesn't care how many books you've read, how advanced the topic sounds, or how impressive your vocabulary is. It draws a hard line between knowing about something and actually understanding it. And most people live on the wrong side of that line without realizing it. Complex language often feels like intelligence, but it's frequently just camouflage. When someone uses long explanations filled with jargon, it creates the illusion of depth. Listeners assume the speaker must know what they're talking about because it sounds sophisticated. But sophistication is cheap. Real understanding is simple, clean, and precise. It gets to the point without decoration. When you truly understand something, you can compress it. You can strip it down to its essentials. You can explain it to someone with no background and still be accurate. That ability doesn't come from memorization, it comes from clarity. And clarity only appears after you've fought with an idea long enough to see what actually matters and what doesn't. Most people skip that fight. They learn definitions instead of meaning. They memorize formulas without understanding where they come from. They repeat explanations they've heard without testing whether those explanations make sense to them. As long as the words sound right, they assume the understanding is there. It isn't. Try this experiment. Take any idea you believe you understand and explain it out loud using plain language. No technical terms unless they're absolutely necessary. No metaphors borrowed from someone else. Just your own words. If you stumble, loop around, or rely on phrases you can't define, you've just found the gap. That gap is the difference between familiarity and mastery. This is why teaching is such a powerful test. When you teach, excuses disappear. You can't hide behind complexity because the listener won't let you. Every vague statement gets challenged. Every skipped step becomes obvious. Teaching forces you to confront what you don't know, not in theory, but in real time. It's brutal, but it's honest. Simple explanations are not shallow, they are refined. Think of it like compression. Anyone can dump information. Few people can distill it. Distillation requires judgment. You have to decide what's essential and what's noise. You have to understand the structure of the idea well enough to reorganize it. That process sharpens thinking more than any amount of passive study. There's also a psychological trap at work. Complexity protects the ego. If something is hard to explain, you can always blame the subject. It's just complicated. That sounds reasonable, even respectable, but often it's a lie we tell ourselves to avoid doing the harder work of understanding. Simplicity is risky because it exposes weakness. The moment you try to be clear, confusion has nowhere to hide. This doesn't mean that every idea can be reduced to a single sentence. Some topics are genuinely layered, but even the most complex ideas have simple cores. If you can't identify that core, you're lost in the details. Details without structure are just clutter. The fastest learners use simplicity as a weapon. They constantly ask, what's really going on here? They rewrite explanations in their own words. They draw crude diagrams. They explain concepts to imaginary beginners, not because beginners matter, but because simplicity reveals truth. If an idea survives simplification, it's solid. If it collapses, it was never understood in the first place. This habit also exposes false confidence. You may feel certain you understand something until you're forced to explain it clearly. That moment of failure is not a setback, it's a diagnostic. It tells you exactly where to focus next. Instead of reviewing everything, you target the weak point. That's how learning accelerates. Simple explanations also travel further. They stick. They're easier to remember and easier to apply. When pressure hits and you need to think, you don't have time to recall complicated chains of reasoning. You rely on principles. Comfort is the warning sign. Learning that costs nothing usually gives you nothing. When you passively consume, your brain stays in spectator mode. It recognizes patterns, nods at familiar ideas, and moves on. Recognition feels like knowledge, but it's not. It's just familiarity. Familiarity creates confidence without competence. You feel like you understand until the moment you're asked to explain, apply, or create, and everything collapses. The danger of passive consumption is not ignorance. It's the illusion of intelligence. You start believing you're improving because you're surrounded by smart-sounding ideas. You can quote phrases, reference concepts, and repeat arguments. But when faced with a real problem, there's nothing solid to stand on. The knowledge was never yours, it was borrowed and never earned. Active learning is uncomfortable by design. It forces you to slow down, to stop and think, to ask questions that don't have immediate answers, to struggle with ideas instead of letting them wash over you. This friction is what builds understanding. Without friction, nothing sticks. Most people avoid this because active learning demands effort and humility. You have to admit when you don't know something. You have to confront gaps in your thinking. Passive consumption lets you avoid that. You can keep moving forward without ever testing yourself. It protects the ego while starving the intellect. Look at how people learn today. They save articles they never read again. They highlight books without revisiting the highlights. They watch educational videos at double speed and call it efficiency. None of this requires engagement. None of it forces understanding. It's intellectual tourism, visiting ideas without living in them. Real learning begins when consumption turns into production. When you take an idea and do something with it, write about it from memory. Explain it in your own words, apply it to a problem, challenge it, modify it, break it, and rebuild it. That transformation is what turns information into knowledge. This is why people who read less but think more often understand more. They pause, they reflect, they wrestle with ideas. They don't move on until something clicks. That click doesn't come from speed, it comes from attention. Passive consumption also kills curiosity. When answers are always handed to you, questions stop forming. You become dependent on explanations instead of developing your own. Over time, your thinking weakens. You wait to be told what things mean instead of discovering meaning yourself. The most dangerous part is how socially accepted this behavior is. Society rewards consumption. It praises being well-informed. But being informed is not the same as being intelligent. Intelligence shows up when you can reason independently, not when you can recall what someone else said. If you want to grow mentally, you have to break the habit of passive intake. Treat every piece of information as unfinished. Shed until you've worked with it. Ask yourself, can I explain this without looking? Can I use it in a different context? Can I connect it to something I already know? If the answer is no, you're not done. This doesn't mean consuming less information. It means consuming with intent. Slow down, stop often, turn ideas over in your mind. Write down what you think, not what you heard. Make mistakes, correct them. That process is harder than scrolling or watching, but it's the only one that produces real understanding. Passive consumption feels safe, but it's a trap. It keeps you entertained while your thinking stays weak. Active engagement feels slow and frustrating, but it's the path to clarity. One builds the illusion of progress. The other builds intelligence. If you care about learning, stop being a spectator. Start being a participant. Mistakes are data, not embarrassment. That idea sounds reasonable until you watch how people actually behave. The moment they make a mistake, they tense up. They explain it away. They hide it. They apologize for it. Not because the mistake is harmful, but because it threatens their image. Somewhere along the way, mistakes stopped being treated as information and started being treated as a verdict on intelligence. That shift quietly destroys learning. A mistake is simply a mismatch between what you expected and what actually happened. That mismatch is valuable. It tells you your model of reality is incomplete or wrong. If you remove emotion from the situation, a mistake becomes a signal, not a failure. It's reality giving you feedback. The problem isn't the mistake, it's the story you attach to it. Most people interpret mistakes personally. They don't see an error in thinking, they see a flaw in themselves. That interpretation creates fear. Fear creates avoidance, and avoidance guarantees stagnation. You can't improve at anything you refuse to test. Honestly, this is why people play it safe. They choose tasks they already know they can do. They repeat what feels comfortable. They stay within boundaries that protect their ego. But safety is expensive. It costs growth. If you never make mistakes, you're not pushing hard enough to find your limits. Mistakes accelerate learning because they narrow the search. Every error rules out a wrong path. It tells you not this. That information is incredibly useful if you pay attention to it. But to use it, you have to stop reacting emotionally and start analyzing. The fastest learners treat mistakes like experiments. Something was tried. A result appeared. Now the question becomes, why did it happen this way? Was the assumption wrong? Was the step missing? Was the timing off? Each question sharpens understanding. Each correction moves you closer to accuracy. Embarrassment only enters when mistakes are tied to identity, when being wrong feels like being exposed. That mindset confuses performance with worth. But intelligence isn't proven by never being wrong. It's proven by how quickly you adjust when you are. Look closely at anyone who is exceptionally good at something. You'll find a long history of errors behind their competence. What separates them from everyone else is not fewer mistakes, but a healthier relationship with them. They don't flinch at failure. They examine it. Avoiding mistakes doesn't make you competent. It makes you fragile. Fragile knowledge works only under ideal conditions. Change the situation slightly and it collapses. Knowledge built through trial, error, and correction is robust. It adapts. There's also a social dimension to this. Many people fear mistakes because they don't want to look stupid in front of others. But looking competent is not the same as becoming competent. One is performance, the other is progress. You can choose only one in the early stages. Mistakes also expose hidden assumptions. Often you don't realize what you believe until reality contradicts it. That contradiction is gold. It reveals the invisible structure of your thinking. Without mistakes, those assumptions remain untested and uncorrected. If you want to learn faster, you need to deliberately create situations where mistakes are likely. Attempt things slightly beyond your current ability. Speak before your thoughts are perfectly formed. Try to explain ideas you're still figuring out. You will fail often. That's the point. The key is what you do next. Do you retreat and protect your ego, or do you analyze and adjust? One path preserves comfort. The other builds skill. Data is useless if you ignore it. Mistakes only help if you study them. That means slowing down after an error and asking hard questions instead of emotional ones. Not why am I bad at this, but what exactly went wrong. Over time, this changes how you experience failure. It loses its sting. You stop dramatizing it. A mistake becomes just another piece of information, no more embarrassing than a wrong measurement or a faulty calculation. The irony is that people who fear mistakes the most often repeat the same ones because they never look closely enough to learn from them. Those who accept mistakes improve quickly and their errors become rarer as a result, so stop treating mistakes as something to hide. They are not insults. They are instructions. If you're willing to listen, they will teach you faster than success ever could. Mistakes are data, not embarrassment. That idea sounds reasonable until you watch how people actually behave. The moment they make a mistake, they tense up, they explain it away, they hide it, they apologize for it. Not because the mistake is harmful, but because it threatens their image. Somewhere along the way, mistakes stopped being treated as information and started being treated as a verdict on intelligence. That shift quietly destroys learning. A mistake is simply a mismatch between what you expected and what actually happened. That mismatch is valuable. It tells you your model of reality is incomplete or wrong. If you remove emotion from the situation, a mistake becomes a signal, not a failure. It's reality giving you feedback. The problem isn't the mistake, it's the story you attach to it. Most people interpret mistakes personally. They don't see an error in thinking, they see a flaw in themselves. That interpretation creates fear. Fear creates avoidance, and avoidance guarantees stagnation. You can't improve at anything you refuse to test. Honestly, this is why people play it safe. They choose tasks they already know they can do. They repeat what feels comfortable. They stay within boundaries that protect their ego. But safety is expensive. It costs growth. If you never make mistakes, you're not pushing hard enough to find your limits. Mistakes accelerate learning because they narrow the search. Every error rules out a wrong path. It tells you, not this. That information is incredibly useful if you pay attention to it. But to use it, you have to stop reacting emotionally and start analyzing. The fastest learners treat mistakes like experiments. Something was tried. A result appeared. Now the question becomes, why did it happen this way? Was the assumption wrong? Was a step missing? Was the timing off? Each question sharpens understanding. Each correction moves you closer to accuracy. Embarrassment only enters when mistakes are tied to identity, when being wrong feels like being exposed. That mindset confuses performance with worth. But intelligence isn't proven by never being wrong. It's proven by how quickly you adjust when you are. Look closely at anyone who is exceptionally good at something. You'll find a long history of errors behind their competence. What separates them from everyone else is not fewer mistakes, but a healthier relationship with them. They don't flinch at failure. They examine it. Avoiding mistakes doesn't make you competent. It makes you fragile. Fragile knowledge works only under ideal conditions. Change the situation slightly, and it collapses. Knowledge built through trial, error, and correction is robust. It adapts. There's also a social dimension to this. Many people fear mistakes because they don't want to look stupid in front of others. But looking competent is not the same as becoming competent. One is performance, the other is progress. You can choose only one in the early stages. Mistakes also expose hidden assumptions. Often you don't realize what you believe until reality contradicts it. That contradiction is gold. It reveals the invisible structure of your thinking. Without mistakes, those assumptions remain untested and uncorrected. If you want to learn faster, you need to deliberately create situations where mistakes are likely. Attempt things slightly beyond your current ability. Speak before your thoughts are perfectly formed. Try to explain ideas you're still figuring out. You will fail often. That's the point. The key is what you do next. Do you retreat and protect your ego, or do you anal? Eyes and adjust. One path preserves comfort. The other builds skill. Data is useless if you ignore it. Mistakes only help if you study them. That means slowing down after an error and asking hard questions instead of emotional ones. Not, why am I bad at this, but what exactly went wrong? Over time, this changes how you experience failure. It loses its sting. You stop dramatizing it. A mistake becomes just another piece of information. No more embarrassing than a wrong measurement or a faulty calculation. The irony is that people who fear mistakes the most.
What if the whole idea of genius is backwards? What if the people who seem impossibly brilliant aren't blessed with some magical gift, but rather they've simply learned to use their mind in a way that anyone can learn? Most people think intelligence is fixed. You either have it or you don't. But watch what happens when someone truly understands something versus when they've merely memorized it. The difference isn't in the brain they were born with. It's in how they've trained that brain to work. The real question isn't whether you're smart enough. The question is, are you thinking or are you just collecting answers? Here's the problem. Walk into any classroom, any library, anywhere people are trying to learn, and you'll see the same mistake repeated endlessly. Someone sits down with a textbook. They read a page. They underline the important parts. They read it again. Maybe they copy some notes. They feel productive. They feel like they're learning. But ask them to explain what they just read without looking at the book, and watch what happens. They stumble. They use the exact phrases from the text. They can't put it in their own words. They certainly can't explain why it's true or what it really means. This is the illusion of knowledge. It feels like learning because you're doing something. Your eyes are moving across words. Your hand is moving across paper. But your mind is just a passive receiver, letting information wash over it like water over a stone. The brain doesn't work by absorption. It works by reconstruction. This is fundamental, and most people never grasp it. Think about what happens when you really understand something. Let's say you're trying to understand why heavier objects don't actually fall faster than lighter ones, despite what seems obvious from everyday experience. You can memorize that Galileo proved this. You can write it down. You can repeat it on a test. But do you understand it? Understanding means you can rebuild the idea from scratch. You can explain why a feather and a hammer fall at the same rate in a vacuum. You can work through the reasoning. You can answer questions you've never been asked before because you grasp the underlying principle, not just the conclusion. This is the first key to training your mind. You must become an active rebuilder, not a passive receiver. Here's how this works in practice. When you encounter an idea, any idea, your immediate instinct should be to take it apart and put it back together in your own way. Don't just read that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Stop. Ask yourself, what does that actually mean? What's energy? What's mass? Why would they relate this way? What would happen if this weren't true? Take a simple example everyone learns. The area of a circle is pi times the radius squared. Most people memorize this formula. They use it on tests, but do they understand it? A trained mind approaches this differently. Why should the area depend on the radius squared? Well, if you double the radius, you don't just double the area. You create a circle that's twice as wide and twice as tall, so the area should increase by a factor of 4. That's the squared relationship right there. And pi? That's just the proportionality constant that comes from the specific geometry of circles. See the difference? One approach gives you a formula to plug numbers into. The other gives you understanding you can use to figure out related problems, to spot mistakes, to actually think with the knowledge. This leads to the second principle: test yourself brutally. The mind is a master of deception. It convinces you that familiarity equals understanding. You've seen an equation before, so you feel like you know it. You've heard an explanation, so you believe you understand it. But familiarity is not understanding. The only way to know if you really understand something is to close the book, put away the notes, and try to explain it from scratch. Better yet, try to explain it to someone else who knows nothing about it. Or write it out as if you're teaching it. This is uncomfortable. This is where you discover all the gaps in your understanding. That equation you thought you knew? Suddenly you can't remember why that term is negative. That process you thought you understood? You realize you skipped 3 steps in your mind without noticing. Most people avoid this discomfort. They keep rereading. They keep reviewing. They stay in the safe zone where they can look at the material and think, yes, I know this. But recognition is not recall. Recognition is not understanding. A trained mind seeks out this discomfort. It deliberately tests itself at every step. After reading a section, close the book. What were the main ideas? Can you explain them without looking? Can you solve a problem using those ideas? If not, you haven't learned it yet. You've only been exposed to it. The third principle might seem contradictory. Play with ideas. Learning isn't meant to be grim determination and forced memorization. The brain learns best when it's curious, when it's exploring, when it's asking what-if questions. Take any concept you're trying to understand and push it to extremes. What happens if this number gets very large? Very small? 0? Negative? What if you reverse the process? What if you change one variable? Suppose you're learning about levers. Don't just memorize the formula for mechanical advantage. Play with it. What happens if you make the fulcrum very close to the load? The force you need gets smaller, but you have to move your end much farther. There's a trade-off. Why? Push it further. What if the fulcrum is right at the load? At your hand? The formula breaks down in interesting ways. This kind of play isn't wasting time. This is how understanding deepens. You're exploring the boundaries of an idea, seeing where it works and where it fails, building intuition that no amount of memorization can provide. Here's something profound about how the mind actually works. It doesn't store information in neat, labeled boxes. It stores connections, patterns, relationships. When you play with an idea, when you connect it to other things you know, When you look at it from different angles, you're building a web of associations. And that web is what makes knowledge retrievable and useful. Think about someone who's genuinely skilled in mathematics. They don't just know formulas. They see relationships. They recognize patterns. They can approach a new problem and think, this reminds me of that other thing. Maybe I can use a similar approach. That ability doesn't come from memorization. It comes from playing with ideas until the connections become natural. The fourth principle, simplify ruthlessly. There's a test for whether you understand something. Can you explain it simply? Not with jargon, not with complex terminology, but in plain words that anyone could grasp. Complexity is often a mask for confusion. When someone explains something using lots of technical terms and elaborate constructions, it's frequently because they don't really understand it themselves. They're hiding behind the language. Real understanding strips away the unnecessary complexity. It gets to the core of what's actually happening. Take the concept of entropy. In textbooks, it's described with statistical mechanics and thermodynamic equations. But what is it really? It's the universe's tendency toward disorder. A drop of ink spreads through water because there are vastly more ways for the molecules to be spread out than concentrated. That's it. That's the fundamental idea. The mathematics describes it precisely, yes, but the core concept is simple. When you're learning something, keep asking, what's the simple version? What's really going on here beneath all the fancy language? If you can't find the simple explanation, you probably don't understand it yet. This doesn't mean everything can be reduced to a sentence. Some ideas are genuinely complex, but every complex idea is built from simpler components. Break it down, find those components, understand each piece, then rebuild. Now, here's what's really happening when you train your mind this way. You're not just learning specific facts or techniques, you're changing how your brain processes information. The brain is remarkably plastic. It physically changes based on how you use it. When you practice active reconstruction instead of passive reading, you're building stronger neural pathways. When you test yourself, you're strengthening recall mechanisms. When you play with ideas, you're creating connections. When you simplify, you're organizing information in more efficient patterns. But there's something deeper still. You're developing what might be called intellectual independence. Most people are taught to trust authorities, to accept what the textbook says, to memorize what the teacher explains. But understanding requires skepticism, not stubborn denial of facts, but healthy questioning. Why should this be true? How do we know this? What evidence supports it? What would prove it wrong? This skeptical mindset is crucial. It forces you to actually think about what you're learning instead of just accepting it. And remarkably, this skepticism often leads to deeper understanding than blind acceptance ever could. Consider any scientific principle you've learned. Don't just accept it because it's in a book. Think about the evidence. What observations led to this conclusion? What experiments tested it? Are there alternative explanations? Understanding the path to knowledge is often more valuable than the knowledge itself. This isn't about rejecting established science. It's about understanding why it's established, what makes it reliable, where the boundaries of our knowledge lie. Let's bring this down to practical application. Suppose you're studying physics, trying to understand Newton's laws of motion. Here's what the untrained approach looks like. Read the laws, memorize them, practice plugging numbers into formulas, pass the test, forget everything in 6 months. Here's what the trained approach looks like. Start with the first law. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by a force. Don't just read it. Close your eyes and picture it. A puck sliding on ice keeps going until friction stops it. But what if there were no friction? It would keep going forever. Why? Because there's nothing to stop it. That's not obvious from everyday experience where everything slows down. But in space, objects do keep moving. The law suddenly makes sense. Now, test yourself. Without looking, can you state the law? Can you explain why it seems wrong in daily life, but is actually true? Can you give examples? Now play with it. What about circular motion? An object moving in a circle is constantly changing direction. Does that violate the first law? No, because changing direction requires a force. the string pulling the object inward, or gravity pulling a planet toward the sun, the law still holds. Now, simplify it. What's the core idea? Things keep doing what they're doing unless something makes them change. That's inertia. That's the fundamental insight. Do this with every concept. Make it your own. Don't be satisfied with memorization. Demand understanding. Or suppose you're reading history, the fall of the Roman Empire. The untrained mind reads about dates, emperors, battles, memorizes key facts, forgets them quickly. The trained mind asks different questions. What were the underlying causes? Economic, political, military? How did they interact? Could the fall have been prevented? What patterns appear here that show up in other civilizations? How do we actually know what happened so long ago? What evidence exists? What's speculation? This deeper questioning transforms history from a list of facts to memorize into a fascinating puzzle to understand. And paradoxically, this approach makes the facts easier to remember because they're connected to understanding rather than floating in isolation. The same principles apply to learning a language, understanding music, studying mathematics, mastering a craft, active reconstruction, brutal self-testing, playful exploration, ruthless simplification. These aren't specific to one field. They're how the mind learns anything deeply. But here's the beautiful part. As you practice these techniques, something remarkable happens. Learning becomes easier. Not because the material gets simpler, but because your mind becomes stronger. You develop mental tools that work across domains. You build confidence in your ability to figure things out. You stop being afraid of difficult material because you know how to break it down and understand it. This is what people mistake for genius. It's not some innate gift, it's a trained skill. The difference between someone who seems brilliant and someone who struggles isn't the brain they were born with, it's how they've learned to use that brain. Think about the implications of this. If understanding is a skill you can develop, then the limits on what you can learn are far broader than most people imagine. That subject that seems impossibly difficult, it's probably just being approached wrong. Those people who seem naturally talented, they've probably just developed better learning strategies, often without even realizing it. The tragedy is that most educational systems teach the exact opposite of what actually works. They reward memorization. They discourage questioning. They present knowledge as finished facts to be absorbed, rather than ideas to be rebuilt and understood. They create the illusion that learning means hearing information, when real learning means transforming information into understanding. You can break free from this. You can train your mind. Start small. Pick one thing you're trying to learn right now. Apply these principles. Close the book and try to explain it. Test yourself ruthlessly. Play with the ideas. Simplify them to their core. It will be uncomfortable at first. You'll discover how much you don't actually understand. That's good. That discomfort is the feeling of real learning happening. That's your brain being challenged to actually think rather than just absorb. Stay with it. Build the habit. Make this how you approach everything you learn and watch what happens over time. Understanding compounds. Connections multiply. The mind strengthens. There's a profound satisfaction in genuine understanding that memorization can never provide. It's the difference between carrying someone else's conclusion and discovering the truth yourself. It's the difference between knowing that something is true and understanding why it must be true. This is available to anyone. It's not reserved for the gifted few. It's simply a matter of training your mind to work the way it was meant to work, actively building understanding rather than passively collecting information. The universe is knowable. Reality follows patterns we can comprehend. The laws of nature, the structure of mathematics, the flow of history, the logic of language, all of it can be understood by a mind willing to do the work of understanding. So here's the challenge. Stop asking whether you're smart enough. Start asking whether you're thinking deeply enough. The genius you admire in others, it's not magic, it's method. And that method can be learned. Your mind is more powerful than you've been taught to believe. Train it properly, and there's almost no limit to what you can understand. What if someone told you that learning isn't supposed to feel confusing, frustrating, or heavy? Most people accept the idea that difficulty is a sign of progress, as if the mind were a stubborn machine that has to be forced to understand. But think about this for a moment. Whenever people truly grasp something, whether it's a simple idea or a complex principle, it never feels heavy at all. It feels light, almost obvious, as if the idea had been waiting there the whole time. So the real puzzle is this: why does learning feel hard in the first place, and what does that difficulty actually mean? There's a strange habit people share across cultures and generations. When a concept becomes difficult, they tend to push harder in the same way, repeating the same steps, hoping a breakthrough will suddenly appear. A student sits with a textbook, staring at the same paragraph as if the meaning might leak into the mind by sheer force. Another flips through pages again and again, whispering lines as though repetition alone could create understanding. Someone might fill pages with notes, copying every sentence, believing that a thick notebook is proof of learning. But when these people return to the material a few days later, they often discover that almost nothing has truly settled. The ideas wander around, loosely attached, ready to evaporate. Why does this happen? Because many people confuse the sensation of effort with the experience of understanding. Hard work by itself does not produce clarity. The mind has been built over thousands of years to recognize patterns, extract meaning, and connect ideas naturally. When learning feels impossibly hard, it usually means the mind is being asked to hold fragments without connection, symbols without context, or words without meaning. People push and pull at ideas, but the ideas remain unanchored. Think of a classroom filled with students copying lines from the board. Their hands move, their eyes follow, but their thoughts drift. They cling to the hope that writing down information will somehow transform it into understanding. Yet if you ask them moments later what the idea truly means, many would hesitate. They have recorded something but not internalized it. Observers have long noticed this. People often mistake motion for progress and activity for comprehension. Imagine someone reading a textbook on mathematics. The symbols march across the page, lines of equations, strange Greek letters, unfamiliar diagrams. The person reads each line, convinced that reading is equal to learning. But reading mathematical expressions is not like reading a story. A mind can glide over a line of mathematics without grasping any real substance. The eyes move, but the mind does not. And yet people continue, believing they are studying simply because they are exposed to the material. Here's a different picture. Someone picks up a science text and begins reading the explanations on motion, energy, or light. The descriptions might use familiar words, but the ideas behind them may not be fully clear. Still, the reader moves on, reassuring themselves that everything will make sense later. But the later never comes. The reader has stacked unclear ideas on top of other unclear ideas, building a tower of confusion that eventually collapses. This is the real problem. People learn in ways that feel like learning but do not work like learning. The important truth is that the mind thrives on understanding, not memorizing. You may recall a time without telling a personal story when classrooms relied heavily on recitation. Students repeated facts, definitions, and formulas aloud. The room might have sounded impressive, filled with confident voices reciting knowledge. But ask those same students to explain what the facts actually mean, or how they fit into anything larger, and many would stumble. Recitation is not comprehension. It never has been. This pattern existed ages before any modern tools were created, and it continues wherever people confuse the appearance of learning with its reality. People have always assumed that if an idea is difficult, the solution must be to push harder in the same direction. They believe the mind is like a heavy door that opens only if enough pressure is applied. But the mind works more like a lock. If you don't have the right key, the right approach, no amount of force will let you in. A small shift in strategy can do more than hours of strain. So consider this question: what makes learning feel easy? Not effortless, but natural. What makes an idea suddenly click into place? It is not repetition. It is not memorization. It is not copying. The mind lights up when something makes sense. You can watch this happen in any classroom from any decade. A student struggles with a concept. They twist the idea in their thoughts, uncertain of how it works. Then a teacher draws a simple diagram on the chalkboard, or uses a familiar example, or rephrases the explanation in a way that touches something the student already understands. Suddenly, the idea becomes clear. The student's face changes. The difficulty dissolves. Nothing has been added except clarity. This is the moment people often mistake for magic. But the truth is far simpler. Understanding removes difficulty. Confusion is not a sign of incapacity. It is a sign of a missing connection. When the connection is found, the idea unfolds naturally. This means something important. If learning feels constantly difficult, the method is wrong. Think of a person studying geometry with a ruler and a notebook. They draw shape after shape, copying them from the textbook. But if you ask them to explain why a certain angle behaves the way it does, they can't. They've been drawing without thinking. The activity gives them the illusion of familiarity, but not the substance of understanding. Now picture a different student who studies the same chapter but focuses on the idea behind each shape. Why does a triangle have special rules? Why does a circle behave differently? What do these simple shapes reveal about space? That student learns more in half the time because each idea is anchored. People often underestimate how much the mind depends on meaning. The brain resists empty facts. It embraces coherent structures, relationships, and patterns. When you try to force an idea onto the mind without giving it context, it slides off. When the idea connects to something real, something already understood, the mind holds on to it. So the first shift is recognizing that learning should feel like ideas falling into place, not being hammered into position. The second shift is understanding that confusion is a doorway, not a wall. And the third shift is realizing that difficulty isn't a sign of depth. It's often a sign of missing foundations. This is why many people struggle for years with subjects they believe they are bad at. It is rarely a matter of talent. More often, the foundations were unclear early on, and everything built on top feels uncertain. But the beauty of learning is that foundations can be rebuilt at any time. The mind does not close its doors simply because an idea was misunderstood years earlier. So here is the essential idea of this first part. When learning feels hard, it is not the learner that is wrong, it is the approach. Learning becomes natural when ideas are understood at their roots. And understanding begins when we stop pretending that difficulty is a badge of honor. If people looked closely at the moments when learning truly works, they'd notice something subtle but powerful. Understanding grows best when ideas are broken down into their simplest possible forms. Not simplified to the point of distortion, but reduced to their essential meaning. The mind naturally seeks the core of an idea, the basic principle from which everything else flows. When people try to learn complicated material by holding on to all the complexity at once, the mind becomes overwhelmed. But when the same material is reduced to its basic components, clarity returns. Think of someone reading a thick physics book. The pages are filled with equations, diagrams of forces, explanations of unfamiliar phenomena. Many students flip through such a book and become convinced that physics itself is complicated. But if you watch a skilled teacher explain the same ideas on a blackboard, you might see only a few lines, a simple diagram, and a small handful of key concepts. Suddenly, a subject that once looked like a mountain becomes a series of small steps. The transformation isn't in the subject, it's in the way the subject is approached. This principle applies everywhere. A student learning grammar may feel overwhelmed by technical terms, subordinate clauses, participles, conditional structures. But if someone explains that all sentences simply express relationships between ideas, and that grammar is just a way of organizing those relationships, the entire subject shrinks into understandable form. The same happens in geometry, in chemistry, in philosophy, even in everyday problem solving. Complexity is never the enemy. Misunderstood simplicity is. People sometimes ask why their minds struggle with certain concepts even after hours of study. The answer is almost always the same. The idea is being treated as something foreign instead of something familiar. But every idea, no matter how advanced, is built from things the mind already knows. The challenge is to uncover those connections. For example, consider the idea of acceleration in motion. A student may see the formula in a textbook and become worried because it uses symbols they don't understand. But acceleration is nothing more than the rate at which something changes its speed. Anyone who has felt a cart begin to roll faster down a hill has experienced acceleration directly. The formula is simply a distilled representation of this familiar experience. But when the student treats the formula as a mysterious object, the mind rejects it. When the same student recognizes that the formula is simply a compact way of describing a real experience, the mind welcomes it. This reveals another important principle. The mind learns best through familiar anchors. When new ideas attach themselves to things already understood, learning becomes steady and reliable. When new ideas float without anchors, learning becomes slippery and fragile. This is why people remember stories more easily than lists, concepts more easily than formulas, and principles more easily than isolated facts. Picture a room where students are preparing for an examination. Some students write flashcards filled with definitions. Others copy entire chapters onto fresh sheets of paper, believing the act of writing will preserve the information in their memory. But consider what actually happens when someone writes a definition they don't understand. The hand copies the words, the eyes watch the lines form, but the mind gains nothing. The activity consumes time, but the time produces no insight. Meanwhile, another student who spends the same amount of time understanding a single idea, really understanding it, builds a foundation that will support everything else that comes afterward. This difference in approach leads to a major insight. Quality of understanding far outweighs quantity of material. People often try to learn too much at once because they fear falling behind, or because they believe learning is measured by how many pages they've covered, how many facts they've collected. But learning is not a race along a straight road. It is the construction of a structure. A structure built quickly may rise tall, but if the walls are weak, it collapses under its own weight. Imagine someone studying mechanics in a classroom. The teacher draws a simple block on the board and places arrows to represent forces. Students observe quietly, writing down what is drawn. But if they never ask themselves what these arrows represent, if they never think about pushing a heavy chair across the floor or feeling the resistance of gravity while lifting a book, then those arrows become empty symbols. But when a student ties the arrows to real experiences, everything becomes intuitive. The subject stops being a collection of abstract drawings and becomes a way of describing everyday life. People sometimes assume that learning must be serious and heavy because the subjects themselves are heavy. But the seriousness of a subject does not determine the difficulty of understanding. What determines difficulty is the approach. Someone who approaches a subject with curiosity, who treats it like a puzzle waiting to be solved rather than a burden to be carried, learns faster and more deeply. Curiosity unlocks the natural process of exploration. The mind becomes active, not passive. Instead of waiting for meaning to arrive, the learner seeks it out. This brings up another timeless truth. The mind is not a container to be filled, but a network to be expanded. You cannot pour facts into the mind like water into a bucket. Facts remain disconnected until the mind weaves them into patterns. Pattern making is the real work of learning. It has always been this way, long before textbooks were printed or classrooms were built. Human beings have understood the world by finding connections. Once the connection appears, the mind holds on to the idea without effort. Think about a moment when a teacher explains something simple, perhaps the motion of a pendulum, the balancing of a chemical equation, or the behavior of light passing through a prism. The teacher draws a simple picture and uses ordinary words. Suddenly the student understands. But what changed? Not the student's intelligence, not the teacher's knowledge. What changed was the shape of the idea. It became graspable. It entered the mind in a form the mind naturally accepts. This reveals a final principle for this part. Learning is not the accumulation of difficulty. It is the reduction of difficulty. When people say, "This subject is hard," what they often mean is, "This subject has not yet been explained in a simple enough form." When people say, "I'm not good at this," they usually mean, "The foundations I need were never made clear." There is nothing wrong with difficulty appearing at the beginning. Difficulty is a sign that a concept has not yet been broken down into its essential pieces. But staying in difficulty, remaining stuck there, is unnecessary. Once the right explanation appears, the difficulty dissolves. This is why students who struggle privately often experience sudden breakthroughs when someone rephrases the idea. A small shift in framing makes all the difference. These principles might seem simple, but they change everything. When people stop treating learning as a punishment and begin treating it as a process of uncovering simplicity, their progress accelerates, their confidence grows, and the subjects that once felt impossible become natural. There's a moment in any deep study when a person realizes something fundamental. Ideas are not separate islands. They are part of a single landscape. When learning feels difficult, it is usually because the learner is trying to cross from one island to another without noticing the bridges that already exist. Those bridges are built from simple principles, patterns that repeat across different subjects, different problems, different situations. Once someone sees these patterns, learning becomes far easier than most people imagine. Think about how often people treat subjects as isolated compartments. Mathematics over here, physics over there, language somewhere else, and philosophy in its own corner. Students flip through textbooks as if each subject requires a completely different kind of thinking. But look closer, and you'll notice something remarkable. Every subject is simply a way of describing relationships. Mathematics describes numerical relationships. Physics describes the relationships in nature. Language describes relationships between ideas. And philosophy explores relationships of thought itself. When someone sees these underlying structures, learning stops feeling like a collection of different tasks and starts feeling like one unified process. The mind becomes more flexible. It begins to look for the common threads instead of memorizing disconnected fragments. This shift alone can remove enormous difficulty from learning. Consider someone reading a dense chapter in a textbook, perhaps a chapter on waves, or classical literature, or geometric proofs. As long as the reader treats each sentence as a separate object, the chapter feels heavy. The mind must constantly switch tracks, picking up one idea, dropping another, juggling multiple definitions and terms. But if the reader instead asks, "What is the main idea tying all of this together?" the chapter transforms. The details begin to orbit around a central concept, making them easier to follow, easier to recall, and easier to apply. This illustrates another timeless truth. The mind remembers meaning far more than it remembers detail. People often try to memorize details because they believe details are the essence of knowledge. But meaning is the essence. Details are the decoration. When meaning is clear, details fall naturally into place. When meaning is missing, details become noise. You can see this in a classroom during a lesson on literature. Students might be asked to remember dates, character names, and chapter summaries. Some memorize all this, others forget quickly. But the students who understand the theme, why the characters behave as they do, what the conflict represents, what the story is truly exploring, retain the material long after the memorized facts have faded. They've understood the shape of the idea, not just its surface. The same holds true in the sciences. A student might memorize formulas for kinetic energy, potential energy, or the conservation of momentum. But if the student never grasps the underlying principle that energy and momentum describe how nature keeps track of motion and interaction, then the formulas remain fragile. Yet once that principle becomes clear, every formula becomes an expression of the same idea. Learning flows smoothly. This leads naturally to another key point about difficulty. Difficulty is often the result of studying without purpose. When someone does not know why they are learning something, their mind has no place to put the information. Purpose acts like a shelf. Without it, everything slides off. With it, everything has a place. Think of a student studying geometry. If the goal is simply to pass an examination, the student may try to memorize every step of every proof. But if the student understands that geometry is about describing the structure of space, how shapes behave, how distances relate, how angles interact, then every proof becomes easier to follow. The mind recognizes the direction of the reasoning. The learning is purposeful. Now consider what happens when a person sits with a difficult text and forces themselves to continue reading despite confusion. Many people have done this, turning pages, hoping the next line will suddenly bring clarity. But the next line rarely does. Why? Because confusion doesn't disappear by moving forward. Confusion disappears by stepping back. If the foundation is shaky, adding more material only makes things worse. This is why effective learners pause the moment confusion appears. They re-express the idea in simpler terms. They draw a diagram. They restate the idea aloud in plain language. They rebuild the foundation before continuing. This habit, returning to simplicity when confusion appears, is one of the most powerful tools in learning. It has been used for centuries by people who truly understand their subjects. It does not require talent or special ability. It requires only the willingness to clarify instead of push forward blindly. Another deep truth about learning is that understanding grows through active engagement, not passive exposure. People sometimes believe that sitting with a textbook open is enough, but the mind is not a sponge. It is a sculptor. It shapes ideas through effort, through questioning, through playing with concepts, through checking whether an explanation truly makes sense. Picture someone studying a chapter in physics. They read that force equals mass times acceleration. Many students will nod and move on, but some will stop and ask, why does this make sense? What happens if the mass is large but the change in speed is small? What if the mass is tiny but the speed changes rapidly? These simple questions spark the mind into action. They turn the formula from a static object into a living idea. Or imagine someone learning about grammar. They read that subjects and predicates form the core of every sentence. Instead of memorizing this, an active learner might take a piece of paper and write a simple sentence. Then they break it apart, identifying its pieces. They try constructing a new sentence and analyze that one too. This interplay of construction and analysis makes the idea real. Active engagement takes many forms. Summarizing, drawing, explaining, questioning, testing oneself, these are timeless tools. People used them long before modern classrooms existed. These tools require no equipment beyond a pencil, a sheet of paper, and a willingness to think. All of this leads us toward a crucial insight. Learning becomes easier when the learner becomes a participant, not a spectator. Another aspect worth exploring is the role of curiosity. Many assume that curiosity is something that comes and goes uncontrollably, like weather. But curiosity can be cultivated. When people allow themselves to wonder about simple things, why a shadow changes shape, why a wheel keeps turning once it starts, why certain arguments are persuasive, they awaken the mind's natural appetite for understanding. This appetite pulls learning forward. It transforms study from a duty into an exploration. Curiosity shrinks difficulty because it motivates the mind to search for meaning instead of waiting for meaning to be delivered. As learning deepens, something interesting happens. The learner begins to see that ideas are not just things to be known, but tools to navigate the world. A student who understands proportions sees balance everywhere, from recipes to architecture. Someone who truly understands force sees the world in motion. Someone who understands language sees how thought is shaped. This realization makes learning feel worthwhile, even invigorating. The difficulty that once felt like a barrier becomes a signpost, pointing toward understanding yet to be uncovered. And eventually, the learner discovers a final truth. Learning is not simply about acquiring knowledge, it is about refining thought. The better people learn, the sharper their thinking becomes. They become more precise in how they analyze, more careful in how they reason, more creative in how they approach problems. This refinement of thought is the true reward of learning. Now think about what happens when a learner reaches this stage. They no longer fear difficulty. They no longer rush through confusion. They no longer measure progress by pages covered or hours spent. They measure progress by clarity. They move at the natural pace of understanding, and because of this, their learning accelerates. Learning does not need to feel like an uphill battle. When approached with the right mindset and the right methods, learning becomes an exploration guided by curiosity, clarity, and connection. The mind is built for this. It always has been. And so the final message is simple. When learning feels hard, it's not because the learner is inadequate. It's because the path to understanding has not yet been uncovered. But the moment clarity is found, even through the smallest shift, the difficulty melts away. Understanding replaces confusion. Insight replaces frustration, and the world becomes larger, more connected, and more meaningful. Continue learning, but do it with simplicity, curiosity, and clarity. Let understanding be the guide, not strain. Because once learning becomes natural, it becomes a lifelong companion, not a temporary chore.
Imagine for a moment that genius isn't a type of person, but a way of thinking. Many people believe they were born with a brain bad at learning, as if the mind came with a permanent factory label. But that's just the snapshot of a brain that got used to working in only one way, usually a lazy, automatic way, untrained for deep thinking. The good news? The brain is plastic, highly plastic, a living muscle that reorganizes itself when we demand more from it. Neuroplasticity, that elegant word that sounds like it came from a futuristic lab, basically says, if you train me, I change. It doesn't matter your age, academic history, or how many traumatic report cards you have from the past. The mind learns to learn, and that means intelligence, focus, and depth aren't destiny, they're practice. But here's a detail almost no one tells you. Reprogramming the way you think takes time, months, maybe years. But the difference is, when it changes, it really changes. And that's what transforms someone ordinary into the type of person who understands quickly, connects ideas, solves problems, and learns without suffering. To start, we need to answer, what exactly makes someone seem like a genius? Usually, two things stand out. Off-the-charts memory. It's not magic. It's the result of how information was encoded the first time. A bad memory almost always comes from a bad first contact. Deep understanding. The ability to take an idea and work with it like it's clay, twist it, compare it, test it, apply it, transform it. The combination of these two factors creates the myth of the genius. But behind the myth, there's only method, and method can be learned. Now get ready, because we're going to dive into the internal engineering of this so-called deep understanding and reveal why most people don't think, they just repeat. Most people believe they've understood something simply because they recognized the words. But recognizing isn't understanding. It's just familiarity disguised as intelligence. The brain loves this trick. It shows you information. You think, oh, I know this, and boom, the mind closes the book before even really opening it. It's like seeing the cover of an airplane manual and thinking you can already fly. This kind of superficial thinking creates an illusion of knowledge that, deep down, prevents real learning. Deep understanding is born when you force your mind to explain, not just repeat. This is where the game changes. Explaining is dismantling an idea and reassembling it with your own pieces. It's transforming information into structure. When you explain something in your own words, the mind is forced to use real cognitive energy. And this activates the neural networks that consolidate memory, reasoning, and clarity. It's like switching from a weak flashlight to a spotlight. You see angles that weren't visible before. But there's another extremely dangerous cognitive trap: automatic thinking. The brain loves shortcuts because they save energy. But mental shortcuts are like trying to learn math using only magic tricks. They seem to work for a while, until you encounter a real problem and everything collapses. Thinking deeply requires effort and slowing down. It's the moment when you tell your brain, hold on, let's understand this properly. And that's when the miracle begins. But effort alone isn't enough. You need to ask the right question. The question that activates insight. The question that forces your brain to leave the surface. And that question is simple. Why is this true? This has been found repeatedly in studies on learning and appears as a critical mechanism for converting curiosity into solid understanding. When you ask why, your mind is pushed into the internal engineering of the idea. It's like opening the box and looking at the engine inside. You separate cause and effect, understand relationships, identify what matters, and discard what doesn't. It's a type of thinking that transforms an average student into someone capable of creating, improvising, and innovating. Another powerful practice is testing whether you really understood something by trying to apply it in a different context. If the idea only works in the original example you memorized, you didn't learn. But if you can move the concept to another scenario, twist it a bit, adapt it, play with it, then your mind starts operating in genius mode. And here comes an important, almost amusing detail. The brain doesn't like to think deeply, but it loves the feeling of having understood something deeply. It's like climbing a mountain, tiring during, satisfying after. The difference is that when you really think, this after transforms everything. Memory improves, focus improves, reasoning improves, even your confidence changes. Now that you understand the danger of automatic thinking and the power of explaining, asking, and applying, let's move to the next layer: how to transform curiosity into a permanent learning engine. Curiosity isn't just a pleasant feeling, it's a biological force, a survival mechanism that pushes the brain to solve mysteries. But there's a secret here. Curiosity doesn't arise from what you already know, but from what you almost know. The mind gets hooked when it perceives a small gap, something within your reach but still outside your domain. It's the famous, "I almost got it." This gray zone is the spark that transforms interest into deep attention. And here's the crucial point. You can create this spark deliberately. How? By asking questions that create cognitive tension. Not anxiety, but that slight discomfort that makes the brain want to complete a pattern. Questions like, what am I missing? Which part of this still doesn't make sense? Or, if this were false, why would it be? Push your mind into an activity it normally avoids. Real investigation. When you investigate, the brain lights up areas connected to motivation, memory, and reward, and learning accelerates. But there's something even more interesting. Curiosity multiplies when you transform knowledge into a mental game. For example, trying to predict the next part of a concept before reading it, or trying to answer a question before seeing the answer. Neuroscience shows that when you try to guess something, even if you're wrong, your brain activates learning areas much more strongly than when you just receive information ready-made. Mistakes, in fact, are fuel for sophisticated learning. They create contrast, and contrast creates clarity. Another essential aspect is allowing yourself to play with ideas. Many people think serious reasoning requires rigidity, but the greatest insights come when you allow your mind to make unlikely connections. Playing intellectually is an elegant way of telling the brain, look for new patterns, and when it looks, it finds. But this play has one rule. You need to feel free to make mistakes. Without this freedom, the brain becomes defensive, rigid, trying to seem right instead of trying to understand. And here's the key that transforms curiosity into permanent skill. You must learn to fall in love with the question, not the answer. Answers are static. Questions are expansive. When you cultivate good questions, you create an internal engine that keeps running even after the video, class, or conversation ends. This is how genius minds operate. They don't accumulate answers. They manufacture irresistible questions. Now that you understand how to activate curiosity and convert it into real learning, we're ready to enter the region where genius really begins. The brain doesn't learn in large blocks. It learns in strategic fragments. The human mind wasn't made to absorb large blocks of information at once. It was made to break the world into small, manageable, meaningful pieces. When you try to learn something huge all at once, your brain goes into protection mode. It freezes, disperses, pushes everything away. But when you present content in smart fragments, almost like puzzle pieces, the brain does exactly the opposite. It approaches, organizes, and connects. Imagine this. Each piece of information is like a knot. The brain doesn't want to keep loose knots. It wants to tie them to each other to form a network. The more connections, the stronger the learning. That's why a powerful secret for training your mind like a brilliant mind is to fragment ideas until they become inevitable. When something is inevitable, the brain doesn't fight, it accepts. This is where an elegant technique comes in, the micro-block method. Instead of studying for 1 hour, you study for 5 minutes, but 5 minutes with intensity, clarity, and absolute focus on just one point. In this microblock, you ask yourself, what's the essence? And what does this really mean? 5 well-used minutes are worth more than 50 poorly distributed minutes. The brain learns in focus, not in brute effort. Another essential principle is repetition with variation. Repeating exactly the same is boring for the brain, and everything boring gets erased. But when you repeat an idea by slightly changing the context, the brain registers it as something alive, relevant, applicable. That's why great masters explain the same thing in multiple ways. They don't repeat because they forgot. They repeat because they want you to remember. And here's a powerful image. Learning is like illuminating a dark room with a flashlight. With each small sweep of light, you see more details. You don't turn on all the lights at once. You explore. Genius is in the movement, not in the volume. Finally, there's a serious mistake that prevents thousands of people from learning well. They try to memorize before understanding. It's like trying to build walls without a foundation. When you understand, memory forms naturally. When you memorize, it evaporates. The right fragment, repeated the right way, with active curiosity, creates a mind that doesn't just learn, but transforms what it learns into powerful clarity. And now we're ready to explore something deep. How to transform this knowledge into real reasoning. The kind of thinking that solves problems, creates ideas, and sees patterns invisible to most. Reasoning well isn't thinking more, it's thinking better. Most people think intelligence is a brute force of the mind, a kind of hidden muscle. But truly powerful thinking doesn't come from effort, it comes from internal organization. A trained mind doesn't desperately chase answers, it creates pathways. Imagine that each problem is a closed box. The common mind tries to break open the box. The brilliant mind first tries to understand the shape of the lock. It doesn't waste energy, it directs energy. And reasoning is that, direction. One of the most elegant principles for training this kind of thinking is the mother question technique. Every complex question can be reduced to a simple question that organizes the chaos. You ask questions like, what's really happening here? What's the essential part of this? What do I need to ignore to understand? The mind gains clarity not when it adds more information, but when it removes noise. Another fundamental point, you only truly understand something when you can explain it with simple words. Not simple because you're limited, simple because you're deep. Complication is a disguise for confusion. Simplicity is the mark of comprehension. When your brain translates an idea to its most essential form, it's as if it's drawing an internal map, and a clear map is always more useful than a foggy landscape. Here's a powerful analogy. Thinking is like tuning an instrument. If you tune string by string, sound by sound, the music flows. If you try to play with everything out of tune, it becomes noise. So whenever your mind gets stuck, stop and tune a single string. Redefine focus. Formulate a central question. Eliminate an irrelevant detail. A tuned mind produces insights with little effort, almost as if it's hearing the answer instead of manufacturing it. And there's still a secret that few understand. Thinking is a physical art. Ideas only align when you get them out of your head. Speak out loud. Draw, write scribbles, trace arrows. The mind is brilliant, but it's a terrible place to store loose thoughts. When you externalize, the brain frees up space and starts to see invisible relationships. Insight comes because you gave it space to be born. When you master this way of thinking, something powerful happens. Problems stop being monsters and become mechanisms. And when you understand the mechanism, you control the outcome. Now that you master clarity, let's advance to an even more sophisticated point. How to transform knowledge and reasoning into real creativity. That rare ability to see solutions where no one else is looking. Creativity isn't a magical talent reserved for geniuses. It's a specific way of combining information. The common mind looks for answers within the obvious. The creative mind takes pieces no one imagined together and builds something new. And when you learn this process, your mind starts producing ideas like breathing. The first key to creativity is accepting a simple fact. Your mind hates empty, so it fills spaces. If you create the right space, it fills with solutions. But if you live squeezed by anxiety, haste, and excess stimulation, it only fills with noise. Creativity is silence, where a flash is. That's why moments of pause, shower, walk, coffee, looking out the window, are hidden laboratories of the brain. While you think you're not thinking, your mind is connecting wires that were previously separate. But it's not enough to wait for the flash. Creative insight is an active process, almost engineering. First you collect pieces, then you dismantle, then you recombine. A simple and powerful way to do this is to ask, what if I do the opposite? What if this works without this part? What element can I steal from another area and put here? The world's most creative minds don't invent from scratch. They transplant ideas. And here comes one of the most elegant techniques for training the mind like a genius: cognitive contrast. When you compare two distant ideas, physics and cooking, music and math, art and engineering, your mind creates bridges. And it's on these bridges that unique solutions are born. The more varied your repertoire, the more powerful your capacity for invention. A narrow mind creates little. A broad mind creates world. There's also an essential detail that almost no one understands. Creativity requires courage. Yes, courage, because every new idea seems silly before it seems brilliant. And whoever fears embarrassment never accesses their true creative potential. Fear blocks the flow. Curiosity releases it. The creative mind is the mind that allows itself to fail fast, test fast, adjust fast. Creating is playing with the unknown until it becomes familiar. And the most beautiful point of all, creativity isn't about being different. It's about being perceptibly useful. A genius idea isn't the most exotic. It's the one that solves something elegantly. Creativity is functional aesthetics. It's when the solution is so good it seems simple. But it only seems that way because you did the hard work of really thinking. Now that you master reasoning and creativity, let's enter the territory that separates common minds from extraordinary minds. How to transform knowledge, clarity, and creativity into real skill. The ability to learn anything quickly. Learning fast isn't a gift, it's method. And the method starts with a simple question that almost no one has the courage to ask. What exactly didn't I understand? It seems obvious, but observe. Most people fake comprehension to protect the ego, when precisely the act of admitting failure is what opens space for real understanding. The mind that learns isn't the one that seems intelligent, but the one that allows itself to investigate without shame. Accelerated learning works like assembling a puzzle. You don't need all the pieces to see the image, just the right pieces. That's why the trick is to locate the key points, the invisible structures that support everything else. When you understand the mechanism behind the phenomenon, you learn 10 times faster. It's like discovering the magician's trick. After you see it, you never unsee it. And here's a detail that changes everything. Asking is smarter than answering. Each well-made question stretches the brain, forces clarity, and reveals shortcuts. So think now. Really think. What subject in your life haven't you mastered yet because you never asked the right question about it? Hold that reflection for a moment.
The ability to learn also depends on the skill of breaking complex subjects into smaller, chewable blocks. The most common mistake is trying to understand everything at once and drowning the brain. Don't do that. Instead ask, what's the smallest part of this I can understand now, and then build on top. A brilliant mind doesn't run, it stacks. But none of this works if you don't apply the maximum rule of learning. Teach to understand. When you explain something in your own words, the brain is forced to organize the idea, detect holes, correct flaws. Each explanation is a workout. Each explanation makes you sharper. The more you teach, the more you learn, even if no one's listening. Now, I want you to do something for yourself. What skill have you been postponing learning because it seems too difficult? Write it in the comments. Yes, write it. I read all of them, absolutely all of them. And if you leave your difficulty there, I can help you dismantle that skill into simple, clear steps that finally make sense. Because the truth is this, the distance between you and your next great competency isn't talent, it's method, and you're learning the method. By this point, you've realized an exceptional mind isn't born ready. It's built, piece by piece, decision by decision. And the most interesting thing is that after you change the way you think, the world starts to change with it.
Not because it got easier, but because you got clearer, sharper, more capable. The brain loves whoever challenges it with kindness, loves when you ask better questions, loves when you break big problems into small parts, loves when you explain something out loud as if illuminating your own darkness. That's the real training. That's the secret that separates those who want to learn from those who actually learn. And if you got this far, that already says something powerful about you. Your mind wants to grow. And when a mind wants to grow, nothing holds it back. Now I want to make you a direct invitation. What was the biggest insight you had today? Write it in the comments. I read all of them, and I respond whenever I can. Sometimes a single sentence from you gives me the chance to guide you on the right path. If this video helped you, provoked you, or made you think, then do this now. Like the video, because this takes this message to other people who need it as much as you do. And if you want to continue training your mind with me, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, each video is designed to expand your thinking, accelerate your learning, and bring you closer to your best version. Not the perfect version, but the possible version, built day after day. Thank you for being here. Now go out there and use your mind, not as a spectator, but as the author of your own thinking. See you in the next video.